The ruins of New Haven Colony stretched before Kai like the skeleton of a long-dead beast, buildings crumbling into dust beneath the violet skies of Proxima b. At 16, he had lost everything, his parents to the rebellion, his home to the subsequent military crackdown, and now his last remaining guardian to the bitter winter that had just passed. Scavenging had become second nature to him. With a worn backpack and sharp eyes, he picked through abandoned buildings for anything useful, medicine, preserved food, or materials to reinforce his modest shelter at the colony's edge. The other survivors avoided these outer ruins, whispering about the wild one that lurked here. Kai had heard the stories. A feral alien girl, surviving somehow among the wreckage, attacking anyone who ventured too close. The settlers called her species the Nyx, indigenous to this world but rarely seen. Most had fled when humans arrived decades ago, but this one remained, dangerous, unpredictable, and alone. The first time he saw her, Kai nearly dropped his bag of salvaged goods. She moved like shadow given form, lithe and quick, with skin that shifted colors slightly to match her surroundings. Her eyes, large and luminous, reflected the dying light like twin moons. Where humans had hair, she had what looked like tendrils that moved of their own accord, sensing the air around her. She couldn't have been much older than him, yet there was something ancient in her gaze. "Hello," he'd said softly, raising empty hands to show he meant no harm. She'd hissed, a sound no human throat could make, and vanished into the ruins. Old Tomas, the unofficial leader of the surviving colonists, had warned him when Kai mentioned the encounter. "Stay away from that one, boy. Rykard tried to capture her last year. Lost 3 fingers for his trouble." But Kai couldn't stay away. Something about her called to him, perhaps because they were both orphans of circumstance, survivors in a world that had taken everything else. He began leaving food at the edge of the ruins, dried fruits, preserved meats from his own precious stores. For weeks, the offerings disappeared without a trace. Then one evening, as twilight painted the alien landscape in shades of amber and indigo, he saw her watching him from atop a collapsed habitat dome. "I'm Kai," he called out, keeping his voice gentle. "Do you have a name?" She tilted her head, her tendrils swaying with the motion. Then she was gone again, melting into the growing darkness. Weeks passed. The food exchanges continued. Kai began leaving other things, a small hand mirror, a piece of colorful fabric, a music player with the last of its battery life. Each item disappeared, though he never saw her take them. Winter was approaching again, and Kai worked frantically to prepare his shelter. While reinforcing the roof one afternoon, he slipped. The fall wasn't far, but the landing was bad. Pain shot through his ankle, and he knew immediately it was sprained, possibly broken. Night fell. The temperature dropped rapidly as it always did on this world. Too far from the colony to call for help, too injured to walk back, Kai faced the real possibility of freezing to death. He huddled against the shelter's outer wall, wrapping his jacket tighter around himself as the cold bit deeper. A sound made him look up. She stood there, 10 paces away, watching him with those impossible eyes. In her arms were the items he'd given her over the past months. "I can't walk," he explained, though he doubted she understood human speech. "I'm hurt." To his astonishment, she approached. Her movements were cautious, ready to flee at any moment. She knelt beside him, her tendrils extending forward to sense the air around his injured ankle. Then, with surprising gentleness, she helped him to his feet. Together, they limped to his shelter. Inside, she watched curiously as he wrapped his ankle and built a small fire in the safely ventilated stove. "Thank you," he said, offering her a portion of his evening meal. "What should I call you?" She made a sound, not a hiss this time, but a complex combination of clicks and soft tones. After several attempts, Kai approximated it as best he could, Vex. The name seemed to please her. She smiled for the first time, an expression recognizable despite her alien features, and Kai knew something extraordinary had begun. As winter settled over the ruins of New Haven, Kai's small shelter became home to both human and alien. Vex stayed after that first night, her curiosity seemingly outweighing her wariness. The sprain in Kai's ankle meant he couldn't venture far, and perhaps that's what cemented their unusual arrangement. He needed her help to survive, and she, for reasons of her own, chose to provide it. Vex proved remarkably adept at hunting in the barren landscape. She would disappear for hours, returning with strange root vegetables or small creatures that somewhat resembled rabbits but had 6 legs and translucent skin. Kai taught her which human foods were safe for her to eat and which made her ill through careful trial and error. Communication developed slowly between them. Kai spoke constantly, naming objects, explaining his actions, telling stories of Earth that his parents had shared. Vex absorbed it all with those luminous eyes, occasionally repeating words with an accent that made the simplest terms sound like poetry. "Cold," she said one morning, wrapping herself in one of Kai's spare blankets. Her tendrils coiled tightly against her head, a reaction, he'd learned, to discomfort. "Yes, it's cold," Kai agreed, adding fuel to the small stove. "Winter on this planet is harsh. The first colonists weren't prepared for it. That's why so many died." Vex pointed to herself. "Nix. Not cold." Then she made a complex gesture with her hands that Kai didn't understand. "Your people, the Nix, they don't get cold?" he asked. She shook her head and pointed downward. After several attempts at explanation, Kai finally understood. The Nix lived underground during the winter months, in vast tunnel systems that retained geothermal heat. As Kai's ankle healed, he taught Vex to read basic English from the few books he'd salvaged. She absorbed language with astonishing speed, though her pronunciation remained distinctly alien. In return, she began teaching him words from her own language, sounds his human vocal cords couldn't always reproduce, but he tried nonetheless. By midwinter, they had developed a comfortable routine. Mornings were spent maintaining the shelter and preparing food. Afternoons, when the twin suns of Proxima briefly warmed the landscape, they ventured out together. Vex showed Kai hidden springs of water, patches where edible fungi grew, and safe paths through the ruins that he'd never discovered on his own. "Why you alone?" she asked him one evening as they sat by the stove, her command of English improving daily. "Other humans, together." She gestured toward the distant lights of the surviving colony. Kai stared into the flames. "I was there, after my parents died. But I didn't fit in. The adults were too busy trying to survive, and the other kids." He shrugged. "They thought I was strange because I asked questions about the Nix, about your people. They believed the stories that all of you were dangerous." Vex's tendrils rippled, her equivalent of a thoughtful expression. "Some dangerous," she admitted. "Angry when humans came. Took land, made noise, bright lights." She pointed to herself. "I, curious. Watched humans. Mother said no, but I watched." "Where is your mother now?" Kai asked gently. Vex's color dimmed slightly, a sign of sadness, he'd learned. "Gone. When big ships came. Fighting." She made a gesture he'd come to recognize as indicating the past. "Long ago." Kai nodded, understanding blooming between them. They were both orphans of the same conflict, the corporate wars that had devastated both human settlements and native populations 15 years earlier. That night, a storm hit with unexpected ferocity. Wind howled through the ruins, and the temperature plummeted. Their small shelter creaked against the onslaught. Kai added the last of their fuel to the stove, knowing it wouldn't last until morning. Without heat, the bitter cold would be dangerous for him, though Vex might fare better. As the stove's warmth began to fade, Vex surprised him. She moved her sleeping mat next to his and pulled him close. Her body temperature, he discovered, ran several degrees warmer than a human's. She wrapped her arms around him, and her tendrils gently extended to cocoon them both. Nyx share warmth, she explained simply. Family. Safe. Kai felt a tightness in his throat. Thank you, Vex. As they huddled together through that endless night, listening to the howling wind, something fundamental shifted between them. No longer mere companions of convenience, they had become something more, a family forged by circumstance and choice. When morning came and the storm subsided, Kai knew their relationship had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. In her alien eyes, he saw the same recognition and wondered what new path they had set themselves upon. 5 years had transformed both Kai and Vex in ways neither could have anticipated. At 21, Kai had grown tall and lean, his face weathered by the alien sun, his hands calloused from building their home on the outskirts of the ruins. The ramshackle shelter of his youth had evolved into a sturdy dwelling that blended human engineering with Nyx design principles, partly above ground for the warmer seasons, with a network of comfortable tunnels below for the bitter winters. Vex had changed too. No longer the skittish wild creature of their first encounter, she moved with confident grace. Her command of English had become nearly flawless, though her accent still carried the musical clicks and tones of her native language. Her color-shifting skin, once used primarily for camouflage, now often reflected her emotions in subtle hues that Kai had learned to read like a familiar book. Their relationship had evolved from survival partnership to something deeper that defied simple categorization. The casual touches, the lingering glances, the way they gravitated toward each other in any room, these spoke of feelings neither had fully acknowledged aloud. That morning, Vex returned from hunting with a troubled expression. Her skin pulsed with anxious patterns of amber and gray. Something's wrong, Kai said, setting down the hydroponic filter he'd been repairing. Vex nodded, her tendrils coiling tightly against her head. Ships, she said simply. 3 of them, landing beyond the northern ridge. Military class, like the ones from before. Kai felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The colony had been largely forgotten by Earth after the corporate wars ended. Supply ships came in frequently, bringing necessities and occasionally new settlers, but military vessels meant something else entirely. Did they see you? He asked. No. I stayed hidden. She moved to the window, looking toward the horizon. But they brought tracking equipment. I recognized it from. She hesitated. From when they hunted my people before. Kai joined her at the window, placing a hand on the small of her back. Her skin warmed beneath his touch. Maybe it's nothing, he said, without conviction. A routine patrol. There is nothing routine about this place, Vex replied, leaning slightly into his touch. And they brought cages, Kai. The kind designed for living specimens. Before Kai could respond, a distant rumble shook the ground. A transport vehicle was approaching, a heavy-duty rover designed for off-world exploration. Through his handmade telescope, Kai counted 5 figures inside, wearing the unmistakable insignia of Terraform Industries, the corporation that had originally established the colony before abandoning it during the wars. We need to hide, he said urgently, already gathering emergency supplies. The tunnels. Not enough time, Vex interrupted, her eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. They'll scan for heat signatures. The tunnels are the first place they'll look. A decision crystallized in Kai's mind. Then I'll meet them. You disappear into the ruins like you used to. I'm just another colony orphan as far as they know. Vex turned to him, her eyes reflecting the fading daylight. They'll ask questions. Let them. I've survived worse than nosy corporate soldiers. He gripped her shoulders gently. Go now. I'll find you when it's safe. For a moment, she held his gaze. Then, with movements too swift for human eyes to fully track, she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, an intimate gesture among her people. "Be careful," she whispered, her breath warm against his face. Then she was gone, slipping through the back entrance and vanishing into the landscape like a shadow at noon. Kai took a deep breath and stepped outside to meet the approaching vehicle. The rover ground to a halt 50 meters from his dwelling, dust billowing around its massive wheels. The doors hissed open, and 5 figures emerged, 4 soldiers in environmental suits and 1 man in civilian clothing with a corporate insignia. "Hello there," the civilian called, approaching with a practiced smile. "Didn't expect to find anyone living this far from the main colony." "I'm Director Harlow, Terraform Industries Research Division." "Kai Bennett," he replied, keeping his expression neutral. "What brings Terraform back to a planet they abandoned?" Harlow's smile tightened slightly. "Abandoned is a harsh word for a strategic withdrawal during conflict. We're here to assess the viability of renewed operations." He glanced past Kai at the dwelling. "You've built quite the unique structure here. Unusual design elements. You adapt or you die on this world," Kai said with a shrug. "I've picked up a few local building techniques." One of the soldiers approached, a scanner in hand. "Sir, we're picking up traces of non-human biological material. Recent presence." Harlow's eyes sharpened with interest. "Really? Mr. Bennett, have you had contact with the indigenous species? The Nyx, I believe they're called?" "Everyone who's survived here has seen them from a distance," Kai deflected. "They keep to themselves mostly, especially after what happened during the wars." "Yes, unfortunate business," Harlow said dismissively. "But a tremendous opportunity was lost there as well. The Nyx possess remarkable biological adaptations. Their thermoregulation abilities alone could revolutionize human medicine." He gestured to the scanner. "These readings suggest very recent contact." "I hunt the same prey they do," Kai explained. "We cross paths occasionally." Harlow studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Bennett, I'll be direct. We have reason to believe you've had more than passing contact with the Nyx. Our mission here is partly to establish peaceful relations, but also to bring specimens back for research." "Beneficial research," he added, seeing Kai's expression darken. "We're prepared to compensate any colonist who can help us locate and capture a live subject." "You won't find any takers here," Kai said coldly. "The people who survived learned to respect boundaries." "Admirable," Harlow replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Nevertheless, we'll be conducting thorough surveys of the area." He handed Kai a small communication device. "If you reconsider, or if you encounter any Nyx, please contact us immediately. For everyone's safety." As the rover departed, Kai crushed the device under his boot. He knew what research meant to corporations like Terraform. The night they first met, Vex had been fleeing from similar researchers. He had seen the scars on her back where they had taken tissue samples. Night fell, and Kai waited anxiously for Vex's return. When she finally slipped through the door, her skin pulsing with dark blues of fear and anger, he pulled her into a tight embrace. "They're hunting your people again," he whispered against her temple. "Then we must become the hunters," she replied, her voice hard with resolve. Dawn broke over the ruins with an eerie silence. Kai and Vex had spent the night gathering supplies and plotting their next move. They couldn't stay. Terraform scanners would eventually pinpoint their location, and Harlow didn't seem like a man who took rejection well. "We need to reach the eastern mountains," Vex said, her tendrils gently swaying as she studied a map Kai had drawn over the years. "My people have a sanctuary there. Hidden entrances that no human technology can detect." Kai nodded, shouldering his pack. "A 3-day journey if we move quickly. We'll need to avoid the northern ridge entirely, that's where their ships landed. There's something else." Vex's skin rippled with shades of deep purple, concern mixed with something like hope. "In the 5 cycles I've been with you, I've had no contact with my people. They may not welcome a human, even one with me. Kai met her gaze steadily. At some point over their years together, he had stopped seeing her as alien. Her luminous eyes, the graceful tendrils that could convey a dozen emotions at once, the subtle shifts of her skin, these had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. More familiar, perhaps, since he rarely bothered with mirrors anymore. Then we'll make them understand, he said, reaching for her hand. Her fingers intertwined with his, for slender digits instead of 5, slightly cooler than human skin in the morning air. They departed under the cover of early mist, taking a route through the deepest parts of the ruins where the twisted metal and collapsed structures would confuse tracking equipment. By midday, they had reached the edge of what the colonists called the Dead Zone, a vast stretch of land where some chemical weapon had been deployed during the wars, rendering it seemingly lifeless. We don't have to cross it, Kai said, surveying the bleak landscape. We can go around to the south. Vex shook her head. Too exposed. And it would add another day. She gestured toward the dead zone. Besides, it's not as lifeless as humans think. There are safe paths if you know how to find them. She led him into the desolation, her eyes scanning the ground for signs invisible to him. Occasionally she would kneel and press her tendrils against the soil, reading something in the earth itself. They walked in silence for hours, the sun beating down on them from an unforgiving sky. Late in the afternoon, Vex suddenly froze. Down, she hissed, pulling Kai behind a ridge of blackened earth. A moment later, he heard it too, the distinctive whine of a terraform shuttle. They pressed themselves into the ground as the craft passed overhead, its shadow briefly cooling the air around them. They're searching along the eastern vector, Kai whispered. They must have guessed where we're headed. Vex's eyes narrowed. Or they already found something there. Night fell, and they made camp in the hollow remnants of what might once have been a storage facility. As Kai prepared their meal, Vex stood at the entrance, her attention fixed on the distant mountains. What aren't you telling me? He asked finally, bringing her a portion of food. She turned to him, her skin shifting to a transparent quality that revealed hints of her circulatory system beneath, a sign of emotional vulnerability he'd rarely seen. The sanctuary, she said softly. It's not just a hiding place. It's where our elders preserve our history, our science. And... She hesitated. It's where the joining ceremonies take place. Joining? When two Nicks choose to bond as life partners, they undergo a ritual. A biological and spiritual connection. Her tendrils moved in a pattern he recognized as embarrassment. I left before I was of age for such things. Understanding dawned on Kai. And now? She met his eyes directly. Now I return with you. There has never been a joining between Nicks and human. The implications hung between them, heavy with meaning. Kai stepped closer, lifting a hand to gently trace the curve of her cheek. Is that what you want? Her skin flushed with warm gold, happiness, affection, desire. It has been what I wanted for longer than I've had words to express it. Kai leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers in the Nick's gesture of intimacy. Then we faced them together. The moment was shattered by a distant explosion. They rushed outside to see the night sky illuminated by flashes of light from the direction of the mountains. No, Vex whispered, her voice breaking. They've found the sanctuary. They abandoned caution, running through the darkness toward the conflict. As they crested the final ridge before the mountains, a devastating scene unfolded before them. Terraform shuttles hovered above a newly exposed cavern entrance, floodlights piercing the darkness below. Armed personnel moved in formation, herding captured Nicks into containment fields. Vex made a sound unlike anything Kai had heard from her before, a keening wail that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. Before he could stop her, she was moving down the slope toward her people. Vex, wait, he called, racing after her. A spotlight caught them both in its glare. Alarms sounded. Voices shouted commands. Kai reached Vex just as the first stun rounds were fired, throwing himself in front of her. Pain exploded through his body as the charge hit him, and darkness claimed his vision. He awoke to the sound of voices arguing. Through blurred vision, he made out Harlow standing over him. Fascinating development. A human living among them, possibly integrated into their social structure. We'll need to study them both. The capture order was for Nyx specimens only, another voice objected. The colonist wasn't part of the plan. Plans change when opportunities arise, Harlow replied coldly. Prep them both for transport. And be careful with the female, she's displaying unusual attachment behavior toward the human. Kai turned his head painfully to see Vex in a separate containment field, her skin pulsing with dark reds of rage and fear. Their eyes met across the space between them, and in that moment, a silent promise passed between them. This was not the end of their story. From the shadows beyond the terraform perimeter, dozens of eyes watched, luminous, alien, and calculating. The hunters had become the hunted, though Harlow and his team didn't realize it yet. The true power of the Nyx had remained hidden for generations, but now, with one of their own captured alongside her human companion, that was about to change. The terraform research vessel Prometheus hung in low orbit above Proxima b, its sleek hull reflecting the light of the twin suns. Within its laboratory section, Kai paced the confines of his cell, 7 days of captivity having done nothing to diminish his determination. The transparent barrier allowed him to see the adjacent containment area where Vex was being kept under constant observation, her body connected to monitoring equipment that tracked her biological responses. Director Harlow had been methodical in his approach, alternating between attempts at persuasion and thinly veiled threats. Your cooperation would make this much easier, he told Kai during that morning's interrogation. Tell us what you know about Nyx communication methods, their social structure. You've lived among them in a way no researcher has managed. I've told you repeatedly, I lived with Vex, not with her people, Kai replied, his voice hoarse from disuse. And I'll tell you nothing that helps you exploit them. Harlow sighed, making a notation on his tablet. Your loyalty is misplaced. We're not the villains in this story, Mr. Bennett. The biological adaptations of the Nyx could revolutionize human medicine. Their ability to regulate body temperature alone could save millions of lives in extreme climate zones. And that justifies abduction? Kai challenged. We prefer to call it expedited research recruitment, Harlow said with a thin smile. The benefits outweigh the ethical concerns. After Harlow left, Kai pressed his palm against the barrier separating him from Vex. She mirrored his gesture, her skin pulsing with subtle patterns of blue and gold, their private code developed over years together. Her message was clear, tonight. The ship's night cycle brought dimmed lighting and reduced staff. Kai lay on his cot, apparently asleep but watching through narrowed eyes as the guard rotation changed. What the terraform researchers hadn't realized, what Kai himself had only recently come to understand, was that the Nyx possessed abilities beyond physical adaptations. The first sign came when the environmental systems began to fluctuate. Temperatures dropped suddenly in specific corridors, forcing automatic lockdowns of affected sections. Alarms blared briefly before being silenced by override commands that no human had initiated. In his cell, Kai smiled grimly. The rescue had begun. The barrier between his cell and Vex containment area suddenly flickered and disappeared. Vex wasted no time, moving to his side with fluid grace despite her weakened state. Your people? He asked, supporting her as they moved toward the laboratory exit. They've been aboard since we launched, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Merged with the ship's thermal regulation systems. They've been studying the vessel's designs, preparing. The door slid open, revealing an empty corridor beyond. This way, Vex directed, leading him toward the shuttle bay. My people have disabled the internal sensors, but we must hurry. They encountered surprisingly little resistance, just 2 guards who had been rendered unconscious by some unseen force. When they reached the shuttle bay, Kai understood why. Director Harlow stood there, surrounded by a dozen Nicks who had emerged from hiding. Their skin rippled with patterns of communication too complex for Kai to follow, but the message to Harlow was unmistakable: he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "Impossible," Harlow whispered, seeing Kai and Vex enter. "Our scanners showed only the specimens we captured." "Your scanners detect what we allow them to detect," said a Nyx elder, stepping forward. His tendrils were longer than Vex, gray with age but moving with precise authority. "We have observed your kind since you first arrived on our world. We have learned your technology, your languages, your weaknesses." Vex moved to the elder's side, exchanging a brief gesture of respect. "This is Sereth, leader of our Sanctuary Council," she explained to Kai. "And my mother's brother." Sereth studied Kai with ancient eyes. "So you are the human who sheltered my niece. Who taught her your ways while learning ours?" "I am," Kai acknowledged, meeting the elder's gaze steadily. Harlow's scientific curiosity seemed to override his fear. "You've been infiltrating our systems all along? Studying us while we thought we were studying you?" "A necessary precaution," Sereth replied. "One that has proven wise." He turned to Vex. "The Council awaits your decision, child. Will you return to the Sanctuary with us?" Vex's tendrils moved in a pattern Kai recognized as determination. "I will, but not alone." She reached for Kai's hand. "We wish to undergo the joining." A murmur passed through the assembled Nyx, a ripple of surprise and uncertainty. Sereth's expression remained unreadable. "Such a thing has never been attempted. The biological compatibility can be determined through the trials," Vex interrupted. "I claim the right of choice." Sereth considered this for a long moment, then inclined his head. "The right of choice is sacred among our people. It will be as you request." Harlow stepped forward, his scientific mind clearly racing with implications. "This joining, it's some kind of biological bonding? A permanent connection between individuals?" "It is not for your research," Sereth said firmly. Then, with unexpected diplomacy, he added, "However, there may be another path. My people have discussed your presence on our world at length. We propose an exchange, knowledge for knowledge. Cooperation instead of capture." 30 days later, as the twin suns of Proxima B set behind the eastern mountains, Kai stood at the entrance to the sanctuary's ceremonial chamber. The Nyx had transformed the space with bioluminescent flora that pulsed in rhythm with the assembled community's collective heartbeat. After 3 grueling trials to prove his commitment and compatibility, he had been granted permission to attempt the joining with Vex. The ceremony itself was unlike anything human culture had conceived, part biological merger, part spiritual communion. As Kai and Vex knelt at the center of the chamber, surrounded by witnesses from both species, including, surprisingly, a humbled Director Harlow, Sereth invoked the ancient rites. The final moment of joining involved an exchange of blood and cellular material, carefully prepared by Nyx healers to ensure compatibility. As the process completed, Kai felt a new awareness bloom within his consciousness, a faint but unmistakable sense of Vex's presence, her emotions, her very essence intertwined with his own. "The joining is complete," Sereth announced. 2 become 1, yet remain 2. The first bridge between our peoples. Outside the sanctuary, a small settlement had begun to take shape, a collaborative research outpost where terraform scientists worked alongside Nyx knowledge keepers. The terms of the agreement were strict: no specimens would be taken, no invasive research conducted. Instead, willing Nyx participants would share their biological insights in exchange for human medical advances and technology. As twilight deepened into night, Kai and Vex stood on a high ledge overlooking both the sanctuary and the new settlement. Do you regret any of it? Vex's skin shimmered with contentment as she leaned against him. Not one moment. Below them, lights from the settlement twinkled like earthbound stars, symbols of cooperation where once there had been only conflict. Their story had become something greater than themselves, proof that even the most different of beings could find common ground through compassion, patience, and love. Together, Kai echoed, sealing the promise with a touch of his forehead to hers, as the first stars of evening appeared in the alien sky above their shared world.